Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Garlinsky, and this is Where You Want to Be, the series where I take you with me around the world and through the things I've learned to help you find your place within the world we live in. Today, we are covering Warsaw, or Warsaw, the capital of Poland. Now, I'm going to give you guys some etymology and then facts about the city, and then we'll get into the actual history. The name Warsaw comes from the prefix, which is Vars, which comes from a shortened form of two names, Rostislav and Rostislav, which are two major names in this area of the Eastern Slavic settlement area, especially back in this time. And then Slav, or Sawa, is a very common suffix that references land areas and people in Slavic. Now, to get into the reasons why this name was picked, there's two. There's folklore, and then there's something else. The folklore is that one of the first people to live here was a fisherman named Vars. He fished on the Vistula River and eventually met a mermaid named Sava. Together, they ended up falling in love and decided that they would settle here and have their children in this area off the Vistula River, the river that runs straight through the city today. And it was named after the combination of them two, Warszawa, which is the name today. Eventually, it's corrupted to what we see as today in Polish, and then anglicized into Warsaw. Then the other etymology goes more into the actual history of the nation, which connects to a royal family, the Vars family, spelled the same way as the fishermen. They controlled a lot of this area in the Middle Ages and placed their settlements here, eventually naming their dynasty and what they ruled over after themselves, and this pretty much connects eventually to the place being named Wrocław and Warsaw, and eventually being Warszawa, which once anglicized is again Warsaw. And I'm going to give you guys some quick facts now about the city and talk about why Warsaw is the city that it is, before we get into the history, that is. So another fact is about mermaids and about folklore in general. A mermaid is a major symbol of Warsaw, and this came about the same way as that story with Vars and Zava came together as well. It's that a mermaid swam from the Baltic Sea up the Vistula River and ended up interacting with fishermen that settled in this area. This story goes, again, folklore, that these people interacted heavily with the mermaid. They had a connection to her. They thought she was cool. But eventually, a greedy merchant found her and, kind of like in One Piece, decided that he would capture her and sell a mermaid and have one as his. So to protect her, they ended up helping her escape, got her own little water area, and she decided that she wanted to protect the people that protected her, and that's where the idea of a mermaid protecting Warsaw came to be. And to this day, it's still depicted as a sword and shield maiden, a mermaid with a sword and shield, and that first started coming about in the 1300s when a mermaid with a sword and shield started to appear on the coat of arms of Warsaw all the way back then. Now, another fact for you is about a hill, which is Szczęśliwska. It is the tallest hill in Warsaw, and is actually made from rubble from the attacks during the Second World War, but now is used as a ski slope. Another one for you is that the Creed House is the most narrow home in the world. Let me pull up the numbers for you. At its widest point, it is a whopping 72 centimeters at its narrowest point, I should say, and then 152 centimeters at its widest. You could actually see this very narrow, very unique house in between these two famous streets, which is 22 Chlodna Street and 74 Żelazna Street. And then the final fact for you guys is actually about a Polish political history moment, which is about the Governance Act. It was an act signed in 1791 and is now seen as the first Polish constitution. The unique thing with this is that constitution is the second in the world, second only to the United States Constitution. So now we look back on the Governance Act as kind of a constitution that limited the power of certain members of the government and royal family to give people better representation. And the only people in the world who had a constitution before this was the great old US of A. So both my babies, the US of A and Poland. Our origins begin about 1,000 years ago. It's very hard to really pin down the exact origins of the development of Warsaw as a city, but archaeologists have started to place the first settlement here, called Stare Brodno, existing between the 8th and 9th century. In the late 1200s, Jazdow was actually relocated about 2 miles north and started to incorporate with another community. This community was protected by a castle, which was being constructed throughout the early 1300s. Then, in 1339, a bailiff was actually used to run the city and be the political representation. But by 1376, a city council was formed by the people to represent them politically and advocate for everyone. By the end of the century, there was a lot of development made here, but the main one was defensively. About 2 giant defensive walls were wrapped around the area, and after those walls are developed, along with the other things that had been built at this time, the community really pushing forward, there was a bunch of incorporations made, and the name of this settlement at this time was Warsaw, which is one of the earliest forms of the city we now call Warsaw, or after being anglicized, Warsaw, which is our focus city for today. And now we're at the point where the true history of Warsaw begins. In the 1400s, the town of Warsaw was made the capital of the Duchy of Mazovia, which was a vassal to the Kingdom of Poland. And then in 1526, it started to incorporate more. The city of Warsaw and the province it was in were then incorporated into Poland directly. Then in 1569, what we know as the Polish Parliament was held here, the Sejm. And then in 1573, kings started to be elected here, and then because of this, bridges were built across the Vistula River to help develop the area. Then in 1596, King Sigismund III Vasa of Poland decided to start having a royal residence here and using it as a court. Then by the year 1611, the full royal court had been moved here, and the capital of Poland was moved from Krakow to Warsaw, officially making it the heart of Poland and making it the most important city in the kingdom. In the early 1700s, things started to move up for Warsaw. There was a lot of financial development, mainly because of the banking industry taking off and employing a lot of people, and simultaneously helping the city develop its financial education and diversity. Education was then invested on specifically. People started to open up a school that was secular, one of the first in the area, and then eventually education was invested on even more. All of this made it seem like Warsaw was moving in the right direction, but things did not stay that way. The capital was a representation of the greater things happening to Poland, which was the struggles that started in the late 1700s. The first was the first partition of Poland happening 1772, which saw lands that belonged to Poland be divvied up between Prussia, Russia, and Austria. Between the first and second partitioning of Poland, there was a resistance started here in Warsaw that aimed to stop that second partition from happening at all. It was unsuccessful, and then the second and third partitions of Poland happened throughout the late 1700s, which led to the map of Europe pretty much not including Poland at all. Poland was wiped away. It belonged evenly, or just split up crazily, between Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and the city of Warsaw, which once stood as a great capital, was now swept away into being a minor Prussian city until the end of this very long era where Poland was not in the map, going all the way until the 1900s. But we have more history to acknowledge before we get to that point. The 1800s were a century defined by foreign intervention and the happenings of Warsaw. The most significant one to happen in the early era was Napoleon himself marching his way in as he made his way across Europe. He created the Duchy of Warsaw as an independent state to help him challenge the influence of Russia and other powers in the area. The Duchy of Warsaw made the city Warsaw a capital once again, but this ended once Napoleon's time in power ended, when Russia took over the city once again. From 1815 to 1830, Warsaw was part of the Congress Kingdom of Poland, which was a sort of political entity under the Tsar of Russia to help Poland maintain some kind of independence. Eventually, it blew up into a full-on uprising where the insurrection of 1830 took place in November of that year, the November insurrection of 1830. This was where Poles in Warsaw tried to fully stand up and rebel against Russia in an unsuccessful attempt to gain their independence. After this, the complete opposite was put on. Instead of any freedom, it was 30 years of direct military rule over the area thanks to these actions. Despite the political struggles, Warsaw's economy was able to push on, mainly because of the product industries it had, such as metalworking, leather making, and textiles. It also became an area famous for its rail hubs. And while this was going on, there was a lot of work to try and once again push on against Russia. There was an uprising that happened in 1863. It was suppressed, and the result of this was that Russia took away the Congress Kingdom overall and made it so that there was no representation for Poland. And this started a lot of major things that are seen across the Russian Empire, mainly Russification, which is where any Slavic area is forced to heavily Russianize. The culture is suppressed, the language is suppressed, Russian becomes the lingua franca, which is the commonly spoken language, and Russia does everything to turn their subsidiary, this area they're taking over, into Greater Russia instead of its own place under Russia. The way that different Poles fought against this was actually in Warsaw. This group called the Warsavians tried this approach called positivist, which was kind of this secret movement to keep Polish tradition alive. It was secret storytelling, secret songs, this big movement that spread across the city that was now over 700 people strong, and try to keep Polish culture alive very quietly. This was done in a lot of areas where Russification was common, and different forms of it have been seen around the world when people try and hold on to their culture despite the overlord above them saying they should not. This happened here in Poland. This is also why things started to move forward. All of this secret positivist things to try and keep Polish culture alive actually led to a bit of an uprising from 1905 and then all the way into parts of 1907, which led to kind of the Russian Empire pulling back and saying, you know what, we're going to let some things happen. Polish culture started to thrive again, Polish education, Polish schools, all those things started to come back, and then we're in full swing by the end of that decade, which led to the end of the eventual World War I, which gave Polish land its independence again. There once again was a Poland, and Warsaw once again became the capital city of the country that it always represented, which is Poland. Warsaw, at the time of the early 1900s, was home to the largest Jewish population in any city in the world. There was a lot of things that made the Jewish population here thrive. There was full political freedom, full religious freedom. On top of this, there was even Jewish newspapers, Yiddish theater, Jewish schools. All sorts of these things were allowed to happen in Warsaw because of the strong presence here and because the government wanted these people to have their freedoms. There was slight tension with the different people groups that all made up Poland, the other religions, especially with Poland being such a stoutly Catholic nation. There was a very big issue that some people had with these people being in Warsaw, Jewish people being in Warsaw, and living the life the way they wanted, but none of this really manifested until later. This was many, many decades, if not centuries, of consistent Jewish presence in Warsaw that was met with open arms and very accepting compared to what happened before the war, which was the devastation of the Jewish community, where things got really, really bad and led into what we know as. And to take another step before things really took off in the Second World War, Poland actually had a lot of technological and cultural advancement in that time between the First and Second World War, the interwar period, if you will. There was a lot of cultural enrichment, like major competitions for pianists, like the Chopin competition, Chopin being one of the greatest composers in the history of Poland. The same can be said for violins. There was also technological advancements in the creation of cars, airplanes, and modernization of parts of different cities. So Warsaw specifically took a step forward in this time, and a lot of things were hosted in Warsaw, such as the Chopin competition and all of that, which helped Poland itself really take a step up in this period. But, of course, things took a huge step back as World War II began. I'm not going to give the gritty details of what happened in the Second World War for Poland, but I will say the most important parts so that we are not skipping any important history. Long story short, Poland was hit harder than any other nation in the world during this war. They say somewhere in the Far East. Poland faced direct attacks from the Nazi Party and their army as they came from the west, from Germany, and pushed into the entire nation and then all the way into Warsaw. There was a huge resistance put up here, and even after their initial defeat, the people of Warsaw went west to try and fight the Germans even more, continuing to reunite with allies and continue the fight. But let's not neglect the fact that on the east, the initial pact between the two nations of the USSR and Germany was a split of Poland. The USSR was bludgeoning eastern Poland. There was an agreement between members of the USSR party and the Nazi party of Germany to split Poland in half and not fight each other. It wasn't until Germany attacked that these things changed. But at the time, the USSR was absolutely crushing the eastern part of Poland, and this affected Warsaw eventually. Now, despite this, Poland continued to resist, and they had to face things even outside of actual warfare. One of the main ones was as the occupation of Warsaw happened by the German party, there was a takeover and a creation of the Warsaw Ghetto. It was the largest ghetto for people of Jewish descent and Jewish faith to be stuck in, to be isolated in, to be persecuted in, and to be ultimately exterminated in many of the cases. And many of these cases, the ones that survived were traumatized. All these things that happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was the biggest one in the entirety of Europe. It is the biggest representation of the Holocaust that happened in Warsaw, and it is a stain on the history of the city because of what this foreign nation came in and did to a significant population here made up of Jewish people living in Warsaw. From 1939 to 1942, there was a plethora of things happening in this ghetto, the absolute worst living conditions possible. People were stacked on top of each other, starved, food rations were minuscule, torture was common. All of these things defined the ghetto itself. And as time went on, people started to be fully deported to actual extermination camps, mainly Treblinka, which is the main one that had people from Warsaw sent to. 250,000 people of Jewish descent were actually sent here and perished. And after this, there was a resistance. In 1943, a couple different Jewish forces formed both within the Warsaw Ghetto and outside of it to liberate this area. It was met with a lot of terrible retribution. Unfortunately, the German party that was doing this was very powerful and used the blitzkrieg and used all the different tactics it had to continue to hold on to power up until the very end of the occupation of Warsaw itself. And next, starting on August 1st, 1944, was perhaps the most important moment in the history of Warsaw, which is the Warsaw Uprising throughout the Second World War, or the end of the Second World War, I should say. But I'm going to still be a little sparing with this, and if you want to hear a lot of gruesome details, listen to that in the podcast, which I will put out, just because of the ability for me to talk a little more freely and in a more detailed, for better or for worse, way about what happened here. Check out the podcast for that. But for this, I will say it a little bit shorter, which is that on this day, August 1st, 1944, which was 82 years ago, and I actually happened to be in Warsaw for the 80th year anniversary of this uprising starting, the people living here formed a home army. They knew that no matter what was going on, they needed to stand up to the German occupiers that were in here and needed to save as many people as possible. For years, they fought. It was people making makeshift armies, battalions, Jewish forces, Polish forces, it didn't matter. All of them came together that were occupied in Warsaw and fought. It even got to the point where little Boy Scouts and little Girl Scouts were in what was called the Gray Ranks, which was this unit where the boys ran munitions, the girls learned medicine, and they were on the front lines right alongside the adults fighting against the Germans. Just because of how brutal life was under the occupation and how many people were killed, everyone wanted to stand up for this. This went on for a long time until the Germans started to use very, very, very dirty tactics, using human hostages as shields, human shields, if you will, and doing horrible things to women, starting to really target children and anyone in between. And all of this went on until eventually the effort of the United States in the West drew all the German forces out of Warsaw and ended the occupation. All of this was happening while the USSR was bludgeoning the eastern side of Poland, but refused to actually enter Warsaw while the German forces were there. And it wasn't until the German forces left that the USSR moved in. And as they moved in, this was another overlooked, but also maybe one of the worst parts of the war, was that the USSR, as they came from their border and pushed all the way to Poland and pushed into Warsaw and pushed across the whole country, what they did was horrible. It was a whole lot of misconduct sexually. It was very forced inconsensual actions across the entirety of the geography of Poland by these Russian USSR soldiers to the women of the area. And it was followed by pillaging. It was followed by anything you could possibly see. And by the time that they actually got to Warsaw, it was seen that the final order of the Germans was clear. Hendrik Himmler, who was one of the second highest people in command in the Nazi army, decided to have Warsaw completely destroyed. The move was to do airstrikes, firebombs, flamethrowers, all of that. So at the point of the USSR arriving, it was about 90% of Poland that was fully destroyed. And it wasn't until much later, right around February 1st of 1945, that under the USSR, which had taken over Poland and refused to give it up, that a new provincial government was established with the hope of rebuilding Warsaw and rebuilding the nation itself. And it was also, to give them credit, the USSR that discovered all the extermination and concentration camps that were present in eastern Poland that were, at one point, I should say, behind German lines, so no one knew what was going on except for the people doing it. And they're the ones that blew the whistle and made really public all the horrors that were happening here and proved to the Americans, Brits, and French that all that they had been hearing about what the Nazis were doing was true. What followed this war and all the horrors that came with it was, of course, the Cold War, where Poland was definitively stuck behind the Iron Curtain and was used as a major chess piece throughout the entirety of the Cold War. In 1955, the counter to the NATO agreement was signed. This was the Warsaw Pact, which pretty much put every single Eastern Bloc country that would agree to it in the same kind of thing, where anyone in the USSR satellite state system, and I should say just the USSR satellite states, not everyone behind the Iron Curtain, anyone in there would agree to kind of follow the same rules as NATO. If someone was attacked and it was the defensive war that had to happen, everyone would come back them on their behalf. So this came to the test actually in 1979 when Russia invaded Afghanistan and nobody backed them up because of the fact that this wasn't defensive, it was offensive. It was an attack against Afghanistan. And things rolled on and there was a lot of resistance and different things done to try and stop Soviet rule. It wasn't very loud because of how close Poland was to the whole situation and completely being maimed by Russia if they wanted to, Russia itself under the USSR. And this continued all the way until 1991 when the Soviet Union fell and the entire operation fell apart. Very quickly, Warsaw turned from a very controlled market to a full market economy where everything reopened back up. They invested heavily in their tourism, in the city skyline, in developing construction, all sorts of things like that, so that Warsaw could bounce back really quickly. It tried to separate itself from its Soviet era very fast, and despite its connection to Soviet era, it leaned super, super west. And this drew in a lot of companies. Warsaw was cheap to invest in. It was cheap to open businesses in. It was cheap to put major hubs in to get access to the Eastern European market, which was blocked off from the world for so long. So this is when Warsaw started to be filled with office buildings, skyscrapers, high rises, all of those things to change what the city was in its new town area while the old town was being rebuilt to fix all that happened during the Second World War. And this continued on into the 2000s as Warsaw's standard of living started to move up and more investment came into the city to eventually change the quality of life, to change how much money you could make in Poland, just to change the overall lifestyle for people living here. And all of that culminated in just a split in Warsaw politics, where at first it went very far right and people got very conservative, got angry against those that were not nationally Polish, and then it went back to a very far left where it was very accepting and diverse accepting, I should say, and then once again went back far right to become, far in that sense, and got resistant again, as we see with the current Polish government, where it's very tight, and all that manifests into the present, where today Warsaw is a major, heartstrong capital of Poland. It represents the history here very well. It represents the highs, the lows, the struggles of being Polish, and everything in between. And on top of that, it has dealt with the international things. It's dealt with being pulled in the direction of NATO, which Warsaw and Poland did join after the end of the Cold War, and dealing with the fact that it is so close to Russia. But no matter how you feel about all this that has happened, the way Warsaw's government is today, the way Poland is today, you have to accept what happened here and all the horrors this country went through and its ability to bounce back despite all that. And all of that gets us to the present, where resilient is Warsaw and her people. And no matter what is happening, it is in a very unique position, stuck between a very desperate Russia that is losing its marbles and an unstable EU surrounding it. Warsaw and Greater Poland are going to be a very divided and confusing city and future to figure out, but it is anything but secure at this point. And the only people that know what is going to happen are the people living through it right now. So that's going to be the end of the history I have for you. And again, if you want to know more, I went into much more detail, especially on the World War II era and all that happened during the worst massacre in human history. In that era, I talked about all of that in the podcast right above. And in my episode on Poland, I covered the greater history of Poland in general and the greater history of Warsaw in detail for both of these. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely go check those out. And now that we've covered some of the abridged history of Warsaw, we're going to get into some historical sites and talk about how they got there. The first site is the Royal Castle of Warsaw. It was originally built in the late 1200s as a wooden fortress for the Dukes of Mazovia, which was that first political entity that ruled over the town that eventually became Warsaw. It became the seat of Polish kings and the country's government in the late 1500s under King Sigismund III Vasa. The castle underwent significant expansions and renovations over the centuries. It became a center for royal ceremonies, parliamentary sessions, and different cultural events. During the Second World War, the castle was almost completely destroyed by German forces. And after the war ended, a huge reconstruction effort began and went on throughout the 1970s. Different plans that were preserved throughout history, as well as paintings, fragments, and more, were all put together to give us a semblance of what the castle was in its original status. Today, the castle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as well as a museum that showcases the Polish history of royalty and the history of Polish resistance. Warsaw's Old Town. It's a wide-ranging area that is the most popular area in Warsaw for tourism. Around 90% of Warsaw was destroyed in World War II, but it has been nearly completely rebuilt in the same fashion and style that it was back in its prime. Old churches, stone fronts, and homes can be seen around the old city as a time capsule of Warsaw's past. This is where you'll see the most history in Warsaw, and speaking of history, the best place to really dive in is at the National Archaeological Museum of Warsaw. This is a museum that has multiple floors which display the history of the city. Its fine art and other archaeological pieces are on display year-round. It is free on certain Thursdays in case you want the experience without the cost. A few other things to check out are the Katyn Massacre sculpture, which talk about the history of one of the worst massacres in the whole war done by the USSR, as well as many other historical sites throughout the whole city. Now that we've done some historical sites and history itself, I'm going to talk to you about my tips for going to the city. The first thing I recommend is to definitely do a free walking tour of Warsaw. The city, although completely reconstructed in the Old Town area, is so historical and has so many different parts to it. I will say the one I went on was rather lengthy, and after a rather considerable night of drinking in the city, and also coming from Berlin the day before, was coming off not enough sleep to really pay attention, and I was very tired and kind of blown away by how long this tour was. But you do get a lot for your worth, considering it is a free walking tour, and people are only asking you to pay what you think it was worth, and this one was very worth it. So definitely check out any of the free walking tours for Warsaw. The next thing I recommend is a Warsaw pub crawl. Find one with an open bar for about 20 extra euros. That's the one that really took care of me. I walked up, realized that it was all you can drink if you paid a little extra, and it was totally worth it. I was very buzzed, and all the bars we went to were fun. The energy was fun. It takes you around the city to 4 or 5 bars, and you end up in a club, as most of them do. It came with drink discounts, fun games, and a lot of cool people to meet. This is probably where I met my most diverse group of people when it came to any type of thing like this, and it was truly a joy to spend the night in Warsaw this way. Truly one of the most fun things I did in the city, and it's just something I can't recommend enough. But finally is my top recommendation, which would be to eat at Piesflaki Gorace. This is just outside the heart of Old Town and the Royal Castle. It is a small, authentic Polish place that offers a bunch of dishes and beer. There is an offering of many different dumplings with meat and sauces in a very traditional Polish sense. The best dish I had there was a potato cake, which came with a serving of pork and sour cream. Truly still one of the best dishes I've ever had in my life. It reminded me of something that my babушka couldn't even make as well because of how quality this food was. The owner also saw the fact that I came here multiple times. I literally ate all my meals outside of breakfast here while I was in Warsaw just because I fell in love with the energy they brought and the very small business feel to it, that he ended up coming out and offering me something a little stronger than the beer. He had this handmade liquor, which when I asked, "Oh, what is this?" He goes, "It's strong." Now I went, "No, like what kind of liquor is it?" He went, "Oh, it is strong. You'll be fine." So just told me it was strong, and boy was it. So I just can't recommend this place enough. I feel like it's very authentically Polish. It's very authentically Warsaw, and it's just in that sweet spot where you're not in the heart of Old Town. You're just outside of it, and you're not downtown in the city where you're so far from the stuff you came to see. So could not recommend it enough. Definitely recommend you come here. One more time. That is Piesflaki Gorace. And now that we've gone through the abridged history, different special historical monuments and their reason for existing, and a lot of the tips and tricks I have for you for the city of Warsaw, that is going to bring us to the end where I've rolled through all these things for you. I really hope you enjoyed them, and I am going to wrap up now. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all the support you guys give me in this endeavor of talking about my travel, talking about history, and especially with this one I'm very passionate about because of my family's connection to the city of Warsaw and Greater Poland itself. So I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. And that is all from me. So one more time, my name is Reese Karlinski, and those are my traveler's notes on the great capital city of Warsaw. Thank you.